Okay, let's pick it up where Stephen begins his speech here in verse 2. Brethren and fathers, listen. Now, notice he includes the word fathers. And I think that perhaps one of the reasons he does that is because he's going to make a big deal of what their fathers did, what their ancestors did in the past, and how they continue that same evil tradition to this day. But whatever the reason is, he does include this statement. Brethren and fathers, listen, the God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia before he dwelled in Haran. Now, again, these guys know this history very well. It's not like, oh, well, I didn't know that. But he's going to select certain elements of Israel's history in order to make his point. Now, I want to show you on a map kind of what's going on here. When we think of Mesopotamia and Haran, those mean little or nothing to you. So I want to show you what Stephen is actually talking about. And of course, in Mesopotamia is where God said, get out of your country and from your relatives and come to a land that I will show you. So here's a map of that area. Mesopotamia is a word that actually means the middle, or two rivers in the middle, or between two rivers, and that's the area between the Tigris and the Euphrates here. And you can see at the bottom of this map, Ur of the Chaldees. It was actually a very, very advanced culture for that era of time. And you can see that that's where God initially called Abraham, according to Stephen's account here. And so they leave and they head up to Haran, and you see Haran at the top there. And in the inset map, you kind of get the context of where that is relative to other parts of that greater region. And so this is the area that Stephen has in mind as he's talking about the history of Israel. Now, I want to show you something that's interesting here, because in Genesis chapter 11, verse 31, you'll notice that he says, Terah took his son Abram and grandson Lot and the son of Haran and his daughter-in-law Sarai, his son Abram's wife, and they went out with them from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan, and they came to Haran and dwelt there. Now, this is the account of Terah, who is Abram's father, taking Abraham and others of his family and leaving Ur and going to Haran. Okay? And then verse 32 says that when they were in Haran, the days of Terah were 205. He lived to be 205 years old, and he died there in Haran. And then chapter 12, verse 1 says, the Lord had said to Abram, get out of your country and from your family and from your father's house. So a cursory reading of Genesis 12:1 almost looks like God called Abram when he was already in Haran. But Stephen says, no, he was actually in Mesopotamia when that happened, down farther south. But notice that the Hebrew there in Genesis 12:1 can be translated had said. And so really what you have in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, is a reiteration of the original commandment to leave Mesopotamia. So Abraham was in Mesopotamia when God called him, but when he left, he was not the leader of the group that left. Actually, his father left as well, which makes Terah, the father, the leader of the group, because this is a very patriarchal type of a society. And since Terah was the father, he was the leader of the group. But God did not intend to make a great nation from Terah. He wanted to do it through Abram. So even though Terah led the group up to Haran, when he became 205 years old, he died there. And then God reiterated the call to Abram. So even when Terah, the father, was still alive, God had specifically called his son Abram, and sometimes I'll just call him Abraham because I forget, originally it was the shorter version, so just bear with me if I do that. But But even when Terah the father was still alive, God called Abraham the son. So I'm going to make a great nation of you. And so God effectively eliminates Terah from the scene, and God then restates the call to Abraham when he is in Haran. So I think you could probably assume that God made the original call to Abram when he was in Mesopotamia, but then when his father died, he reminded Abram of that call, and he left from Haran to head toward the promised land. Okay, and so verse 4 says, Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him, and Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. So an original calling in Mesopotamia, and then after Terah dies, then a recalling again in Haran, and they left for the promised land. All right, in fact, notice in Acts 7:4, he says that they came out of the land of the Chaldeans and dwelt in Haran, and from there, when his father was dead at the age of 205, God moved him, Abraham, to this land in which you now dwell. But the point that Stephen is making is that even though this land is important, God did some supernatural things in calling and directing Abram's life when he was still far from the land. And notice that he had no inheritance in the land there. He basically was a wanderer there. And even though God had promised much to him, he didn't receive it all during his lifetime. And so God spoke in this way that his descendants would dwell in a foreign land, and they would bring them into bondage and oppress them 400 years. Now, there are some things that Stephen says that seem to contradict what happened in the book of Genesis. We just talked about one of them, where exactly was Abraham when God called him? This is another one. It says that Abraham was told that the people would spend 400 years being oppressed. Well, the Old Testament record actually says something a little different. Exodus 12:40 says, now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. So why the difference? Are we dealing with a problem in the text here? Galatians 3:17 also says that they were in Egypt for 430 years. So is this an issue? Does this harm the fidelity of the text? And the answer is no. Let me just say it this way. The Bible often uses round figures to say what it wants to say. I am sure that Stephen knew that that the book of Exodus stated that Israel was in Egypt for 430 years. But oftentimes the Bible writers will use round figures in order to make a general point that they want to make. In other words, the most important part of Stephen's point here is not the exact number of years that the people were in Egypt, but the fact that they were in bondage for a long period of time. I sometimes use this illustration with my students. My wife and I and our family, we were missionaries in Brazil, and before coming to faith, and I tell my students, look, I could tell you that I was a missionary in Brazil for 16 years. I could tell you I was a missionary in Brazil for 19 years, or I could tell you I was a missionary in Brazil for 21 years, and all three of those numbers would be correct. It just depends on what I'm including. 16 years is the actual number of years that I lived in the country. I was actually a resident there in the land of Brazil. But I could also use 19 because that includes the 3 furloughs that we took between the 4 terms we were there. And that would also be correct. Or if I included my deputation time when we spent 2 years raising support to go there, the number grows to 21. And all of those are correct, depending on what the intention of my statement is. And so there's no reason to assume that because Stephen says 400, that somehow he's getting it wrong, he's making a mistake, and that the scriptures are somehow in error. And then verse 7, he says, "And the nation to whom they will be in bondage I will judge, said God, and after that they shall come out and serve me in this place." And in this place, of course, referring to the nation of Israel. And then verse 8, God gave him the covenant of circumcision. And so Abraham begot Isaac and circumcised him on the 8th day. And Isaac begot Jacob, and Jacob begot the 12 patriarchs. And so the word patriarchs here is very, very important because, again, one of Stephen's main objectives is to show that the patriarchs were disobedient to God and rebelled, and the leaders of Stephen's day continue to do the same thing. Notice there's the word patriarchs repeated again in verse 9. They became envious and they sold Joseph into Egypt, but God was with him. So in contrast to the rebellion of the fathers, God continued to be faithful to his people through individuals like Joseph, Moses, Abraham. And some of this I'm not going to read just because it's common knowledge, and we don't really need to read this word for word. You should know that the word patriarchs appears 11 times in this chapter. Again, emphasizing the importance of drawing attention to the forefathers of Israel. Okay. In chapter 7, verse 14, Joseph sent and called his father Jacob and all of his relatives to him, 75 people. Now remember, this is after he reveals himself to his brothers. Then he sends back and says, bring everybody here. Now, Stephen says that there were 75 people. But in Genesis 46:27, if you look at the Greek translation, the LXX, the Septuagint, you'll see that agrees. There were 75 souls altogether. And but in the Hebrew text, Genesis 46:27, the number is 70. Okay, and there's been a lot of debate about this, and what we understand is that the Hebrew text is the original text. The LXX is a translation, and of course translations can contain errors. But if we're really leaning on the Hebrew text to be the correct one, then why does Stephen say 75 instead of 70? Well, again, he is most likely quoting from the Septuagint as he gives his defense before the Sanhedrin. He most likely was a Hellenist himself, having a Greek name, and so he's quoting from the Septuagint. And the fact that he says 75 instead of 70 is not going to in any way do damage to the point that he is making. And so, nobody is saying that the LXX is inspired or that it's perfect. And so, the difference, we recognize the difference here is pointing to the actual translation that Stephen is using as he gives his speech. Exodus 1:5, the Hebrew text there also refers to 70 persons. Okay. And so, again, I'm just trying to get you to see that, we don't really have a problem here because even though he's using a text that's not the original text that God revealed his word in, he is using a text that is a very good and reliable text. In fact, you should know that the New Testament writers pretty much exclusively quote from the Septuagint when they quote the Old Testament, because they're writing the New Testament in the Greek language, and therefore it's natural they would use the Septuagint to insert their quotes. And I'm sure that they are familiar with the Hebrew text and probably even comparing the two as they write. But even Jesus quoted from the Septuagint text as a testimony to its fidelity. Not the inspired original text, but one that was considered trustworthy. Okay, another issue that comes up here has to do with the burial place of Moses, and I'm going to save this one for the next lecture. We'll talk about that next time.